It's time for Speaking of Speaking. Quick tips and tools to take you from stage fright to spotlight. This podcast gives you an inside look from the world of public speaking and speaking secrets you need to be bold from the stage, no matter what business you're in. The host of Speaking, Carl Richards.
Thank you, Matt. It is another edition of the Speaking of Speaking podcast. It is part 3 of our 5-part series. I just got back from a trip to Cuba. Now, you would hope that if I just got back from a trip to Cuba, which I did, that I would have some interesting stories to share, and that I would be able to share those stories and give you some detail. And the devil is in the details, so they say. Now, that can go both ways, but we want to make sure that when we're painting the picture, when we're telling the story, that we're giving enough detail as we cover. There are more than these 5 areas, by the way, when it comes to storytelling, but when we're talking about people, when we're talking about history, when we're talking about geography, when we're talking about food, when we're talking about doing something different, new experiences or different experiences that maybe we haven't done before, we want to make sure that we are doing those things not just eloquently, but so that they are interesting to the audience. And today it's about geography. I just got back from a trip to Cuba, and man, there is so much rich history there, as we found out in the last episode, talking all about the history of Havana, some of the history of the Hemingway House, but the geography is phenomenal as well. It is not only filled with rich culture, but some of the most beautiful beaches in all of the world. Now, I'm spoiled to live in a beautiful part of Canada, not too far from Sandbanks Provincial Park, which is also some of the most beautiful sandy beaches in the world. That's one of the things that this region is known for, Prince Edward County. A lot of people come to Sandbanks Provincial Park every summer to experience the beautiful beaches and the sand dunes. Same reason why a lot of people have gone to Prince Edward Island, by the way. Those sand dunes, of course, are unfortunately were ripped apart due to some of the hurricanes that have passed through this past year. However, they will come back. It'll just take some time. But Cuba is known for some of the most beautiful beaches and some of the most beautiful rolling hills, beautiful treed areas, ocean that you can see for miles and miles. Not only that, but not just beautiful beaches, but beautiful beaches that people have figured out that, hey, we could take a catamaran trip, go to a beach, and have a Cuban barbecue or have a Cuban cookout with freshly cooked lobster caught that day or caught within the last couple of days. That was part of the trip, by the way, was going out on a catamaran. We spent all day on a catamaran, and it was just simply amazing. Not only because of the beaches, but compared to where I am in January in Canada, it's cold, it's icy, it's snowy. Sometimes there's freezing rain. When we were on the catamaran, I think it was -6, somewhere between -6 and -10 that day. It was about 25 degrees Celsius on the catamaran. It was beautiful. It was just simply gorgeous. The ocean was a little chilly, but, you know, it's a big body of water. But it clearly would not have been as chilly as, say, Lake Ontario. Warm temperatures all year round in Cuba, by the way. Yeah, warm temperatures all year round. When it's cool in Cuba, when they say 20, 25 degrees in Cuba, that's cold for the locals. That's the time that you want to be in Cuba, especially if you're from Canada or northern parts of the United States, because that's when it's cold where you are. Let's face it. Pro tips when you're talking about geography: describe in detail some of the most beautiful beaches in the world. White powder sand as opposed to white powdery snow, which is what I would be experiencing in the winter in Canada. Also describe who's with you and share that detail of who's with you. What was their experience? Because sometimes the geography, when you're taking a photograph, think about it. If you're standing outside the Grand Canyon or standing near the Grand Canyon, it's usually not just you. It's usually you and another person in a photograph, right? Same thing when you're describing. Talk about those beautiful, powdery, sandy beaches with hermit crabs everywhere. Talk about the warm temperatures. Talk about rain, talk about whatever it is, talk about that. So I had mentioned Ivan, and he was our catamaran entertainment director. He wasn't our captain. He wasn't the bartender. He was the guy who was in charge of the trip or the excursion itself on the catamaran, which included a stop to do some snorkeling. We could also spend some time with the dolphins, which was just phenomenal as well. And here's the thing. Before we went out on the catamaran, before he set out, as we were just getting everything unhitched from the dock, unhitching the dock lines, he did this silent prayer for good weather. It was kind of funny because he did the silent prayer for good weather, the no rain, just so we would all have a good time. He started to dance around in silence as we're kind of laughing at him. And basically he's describing what we're going to do on the trip the main thing was he was praying for good weather. We arrived for the snorkeling. And by the way, he did say for snorkeling, you can only jump off the back of the boat. He said sharks are out the front. We kind of joked about that because if there are sharks there, I don't think the shark would care if it was the front of the boat or the back of the boat. But he said, no, everyone goes off the back of the boat. And that's for ease and simplicity, really. But if there were sharks to be had, they were not to be had near our catamaran on that day. But it is a place where, geographically speaking, in salt water, yes, you could definitely find sharks. But they were not where we were snorkeling that day. And then we arrived at the playa, at the Cayo Blanco, for our beach barbecue. And I'll tell you something, there's nothing like the taste of a little bit of sweet, slightly sweeter Cuban lobster that's probably been caught in the last couple of days, just cooked right up and served perfectly. And we're not going to talk about food today. We're going to be talking about food on our next piece of the puzzle as we continue to talk about, I just got back from my trip to Cuba, and how would I share that story? The catamaran story was unbelievable. Beautiful beaches. The trip to Havana, we saw some of the rolling hills, some of those deep, rich, tropical forests, which, by the way, Cuba doesn't get a ton of rain. It has a rainy season, not in January typically, or February, or March. You might see thunderstorms, but typically not, unless they're overnight or later in the afternoon. But we didn't see any the whole time we were there. So it was very, very nice. So remember, describe the detail. Share the who's with you. I mentioned Ivan, and where was it? It was Veradero, it was Cayo Blanco, it was on the catamaran, in the ocean, beautiful beaches. And again, always think of the why. The why can come up in many different ways. The why can be, we were looking for something to do. We wanted to do something different. This was not a new experience for us. We'd done it before. But what was a new experience for us was the last time we did a catamaran trip, it was so quick to get everything done. We didn't have a chance to just sit there on the beach and relax and enjoy the pristine wilderness of the ocean. And we didn't have time to notice how many hermit crabs would scurry on the beach. We didn't have time to notice that. But this past time we did. What an amazing experience. Next time, though, we're talking about the food. I know that some of you, your stomach might be turning when I say Cuba and food. But honestly, that's part of sharing the story. And we'll talk about that in our next episode of Speaking of Speaking. Remember, get out there and own the platform.
Thanks for listening to the Speaking of Speaking podcast. Fired up about something you heard today? Want to learn more? Be sure to visit carlspeaks.ca. And don't forget to follow Carl on Twitter @CarlRichard72 or join the Facebook group Speaking of Speaking.